You are listening to The Other Side of the Canal on Mr. Liddle's History Bites. As a high school student, I rode my bike to school almost every day. You see, I lived about 4 miles from my school. There was a shortcut across a series of railroad tracks that ran through the center of town that would cut off about 2 miles from my trip. This was not without its risks, be it from the stray cats that lived in the area or even the occasional train. But because it cut the trip in half, I avoided having to go to one end of town to take a bridge over the tracks. To save time meant that I saved time in the morning and could sleep in later and have a larger breakfast. The desire to cut time and to take a shortcut can be analogized in the macro level of world trade. I was not the only one who desired a nice shortcut. Around the world, merchants, sailors, and ship captains also desired a nice shortcut, and their desires have been embodied in the major canal systems we see around the world today. The Panama Canal, for example, saves 5,000 miles of travel, is used by perhaps 15% of global trade ships every year. However, while the Panama Canal is well known, I'd like to talk about the Suez Canal. The full story of the Suez Canal is rarely told in its entirety, and when examined historically, it raises a lot of questions about agency and historical perspective, and it's much more interesting than merely the story of another shipping channel. Before we dig into the history of the canal, I'd like to cover some of the basics of the Suez Canal. In a history textbook, the Suez Canal is often depicted as simply a straight line connecting the two seas, the Mediterranean and the Red Sea, through a small strip of land. However, the Suez Canal is not a straight line through the earth. Rather, it runs through the desert, a large inland saltwater lake known as Bitter Lake, and a smaller lake known as Lake Tamesh. In total, the Suez Canal is 120 miles long. The beginning point in the north is Port Said on the Mediterranean, Port Suez on the Red Sea. It varies in width, but at its maximum, it is 673 feet wide. By taking the Suez Canal instead of sailing all the way around to Africa, a ship saves a little over 5,000 miles. The traditional story of the Suez Canal is usually told as one of French and British ingenuity and ambition. The goal of the European powers was to make it easier to communicate with their overseas colonies, particularly Britain to their colony in India. The French diplomat and engineer, Ferdinand de Lépez, managed to get a concession from the rulers of Egypt in 1854 to finance a canal which would connect the Mediterranean and the Red Seas. It was a triumph of European diplomatic skill and engineering, which secured European domination of India and Asia for another century, and overall made global trade faster and easier. In some of the older pictures of the canal, you can even see cranes and earth movers. However, doing a little research and digging, if you'll pardon the pun, you'll learn the fact that the canal was dug with over 30,000 unpaid laborers with shovels, which leads to an interesting question. If the canal was built in 1859 by hand, why was it not built sooner? It seems odd nobody would have ever thought of the idea of connecting these two major seas and saving time from sailing all the way around Africa. Somebody must have had this idea before the British and the French. And if they did, why didn't it come to fruition? It turns out that for centuries, rulers have in fact seen the value of connecting the two seas for the purposes of trade and military power. Archaeological evidence and the historical records indicate that there was some form of a canal that dated back to ancient Egypt, designed to sail south from the Nile into the Red Sea. Several inscriptions from the Old Kingdom boast of expeditions sent south along what is now the Red Sea. Another canal in the 7th century BCE between modern Zagazig on the Nile River and Bitter Lake, a distance of 75 miles. This canal is testified to by Herodotus, the Greek historian, though he said it was never completed because of engineering difficulties. According to Herodotus, quote, "One of the Egyptian kings tried to make a canal, for it would have been of advantage to them for the whole region to have become navigable. But he found that the sea was higher than the land. So he first, and Darius afterwards, stopped making the canal, lest the sea should mix with the Nile and spoil the water." Now, this seems to conflict with an account of another canal dug by Darius of Persia sometime in the mid-6th century BCE during Persian rule over Egypt. According to an inscription discovered, Darius ordered the construction of a canal that linked the Nile River to the Red Sea via Lake Tamesh and the Bitter Lake. This is known as Darius's Canal. According to a stone inscription, quote, "King Darius says, I am a Persian. Setting out from Persia, I conquered Egypt. I ordered to dig this canal from the river that is the Nile and flows to Egypt, to the sea that begins in Persia. Therefore, when this canal has been dug as I ordered, ships went from Egypt through this canal to Persia as I had intended. Whichever story is correct, it remains unclear, but regardless, this particular canal seems to have fallen out of use by the time of Roman control of Egypt, most likely due to sediment accumulation, which was a common problem in pre-modern irrigation and water canals. There is also evidence of a third canal, constructed under the Abbasid Caliphate during their rule over Egypt. Like the earlier canals, it used the Nile River as its starting point, and then via Lake Tamesh and another short canal, connected it to the Red Sea. This canal is testified to by several Arab sources, which state that the Abbasid Caliph al-Mansur ordered the canal constructed sometime in the mid-8th century. An English monk named Fidelis described sailing on this canal into the Red Sea. According to what he told the chronicler, he sailed on it in the year 792 CE during his pilgrimage to the Holy Land. The final pre-modern effort to build a canal comes from the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire had a plan to dig a canal that would connect the two seas in the mid-1500s. The Ottoman Grand Vizier so-called Mehmed Pasha, who was vizier from 1565 to 1579, proposed building a canal which roughly aligns with the modern canal's road. But the Sultan declared that it was too expensive and canceled the project. On a side note, this was actually not the only major canal project proposed by Mehmed Pasha. He also proposed building a canal to link the Don and Volga rivers in what is modern-day Russia, and he even sent workers to begin construction in 1569. At this point in history, this region was allied with the Ottoman Empire. A canal would eventually be built, but by the Soviet Union in 1952, roughly 400 years later. So while neither of his canals came to fruition, we should give Mehmet Pasha some credit for being such a visionary. According to the Grand Vizier, the stated purpose of the proposed Ottoman Suez Canal was to make it easier for Muslim pilgrims to visit Mecca and Medina. The Ottoman Empire was the keeper of the Islamic holy cities, and after 1517, the Ottoman Sultan was also declared caliph, or leader of the Muslim world. Making the pilgrimage easier would be a public relations coup for the sultans. Now, I explained how power and legitimacy of the Ottoman Empire in Asia was also tied to its ability to challenge non-Muslims in the Indian Ocean, specifically the Portuguese, in my first history bite, The Two Ends of Asia. But a small recap is in order. The Ottoman Empire, launching its fleets from what is now the Persian Gulf and later the Red Sea, clashed with Portuguese merchants on the Indian Ocean. In the end, though, its continuing wars in Europe pulled Ottoman attention away from the Indian Ocean. Ottoman efforts to support Muslim leaders in the Indian Ocean should serve as a reminder that the British and the French were not the only powers concerned with asserting their power in the Indian Ocean, and they were certainly not the first to propose a canal to do it. A survey of the history of the region demonstrates that every major power and political force in the region of the Nile up to 1700 CE had either built a canal or explored the possibility of building a canal. The idea of a canal to link two seas is much older than British or French imperialism. The drive of merchants to make money, of kings to move their armies, and of rulers to justify their authority, these ideas are much older than the development of the engineering technology that made the Suez Canal possible. Early attempts to build a canal connecting the Mediterranean Sea and the Red Sea seem to have in common are that instead of digging a straight line across the desert, they attempted to use as many possible pre-existing natural waterways, such as the lakes and the Nile River. This fact is interesting in the context of the knowledge that the canal was built mostly by human hands. Perhaps the use of pre-existing waterways was a labor-saving decision, and the recognition of the limits of a ruler's control over labor. After all, corralling thousands of laborers takes a massive bureaucracy and a network of logistics. In that context, a 75-mile canal is very much shorter than a 120-mile canal when considering the labor costs. Perhaps the Ottoman decision not to build the canal along its modern route came from their inability to find the laborers required. When examining the story, we should not view the failure to build a canal as some sort of inability to understand its value or political ineptitude. Perhaps we should look at it as a realistic understanding of the difficulties of a situation or the limits of the technological abilities of the time. If we examine the canal in the question of labor mobilization and cost, then the fundamental shift comes when Egypt transitions from being part of a larger empire to an independent nation. Now, most historians agree that the last indigenous Egyptian dynasty ended with the Persian conquest. After that, it was one outside power or ethnic group ruling Egypt after another. This changed with the rise of Muhammad Ali, who ruled from 1805 to 1848. Now, Ali was in fact Albanian, a product of the Ottoman Empire's diverse system of military recruitment. However, he did not rely exclusively on foreign military forces or powers to maintain himself. Under him, Egypt gained de facto independence from the Ottoman Empire in the wake of Napoleon Bonaparte's invasion of Egypt in 1799. The great powers of Britain and France protected Ali and recognized him as the new ruler of Egypt, but they also intervened to stop him from taking more territory from the ever-weakening Ottoman Empire. Under these circumstances, Ali was free to reshape Egypt. Despite the role of the great powers in securing his place, Ali desired that Egypt be free of foreign domination, both of the European powers and the Ottoman Empire. Many of his reforms focused on the military, on building a modern European conscript-style army of Egyptian peasants, and suppressing the traditional cavalry nobility by inviting all of the Mamluks to Cairo and then massacring them. However, while much attention is laid on Ali's military reforms, he also attempted to kickstart an industrial revolution in Egypt along the lines of that of England. Ali, as the leader of Egypt, legally took control of all the land in Egypt, and directed large estates to grow both sugar and cotton, which could be used in the newly constructed sugar and textile mills and be exported. Now, Egypt had long been a source of textiles on the world market, going all the way back to ancient times. Additionally, Ali ordered the construction of 5 sugar mills along the Nile to create sugar for export. But the mills were not the only new features in Egypt. Ali's successor, Mohammed Said Pasha, established the first official bank in Egypt in order to finance the expansion of cash crops and ordered the construction of the first railway lines. It was Said Pasha who granted the concession to the Suez Canal Company to build the canal. In fact, the Mediterranean entry point to the canal is named after Said Pasha, Point Said. Why did the leaders of Egypt grant this concession? The term concession alone sounds terribly negative, and in light of later history, in retrospect it seems foolish to give away such a strategic piece of land. However, looking at it from the point of view of the leaders of Egypt at the time, the decision to grant the concession was a logical, if risky, decision. First and foremost, according to the text of the agreement, the Egyptian government was to be granted 15% of the net profit per year of the canal's operations, on top of the almost 50% of the shares in the Suez Canal Company. The government of Egypt stood to become very rich from this decision. Secondly, Ali was already building a navy in 1830, and his successors believed in building an export economy of sugar and textiles to promote further industrialization. Those two features of a new modern Egypt would require a Suez Canal to help finance it. This whole project was not without risk. This was the heyday of large corporate projects all around the world. The whole project might go bust. The same ambassador who had secured the Suez Canal zone, Ferdinand de Lépez, attempted to build a canal in Panama 10 years later, only for the project to fail and millions of dollars to be lost. It is also worth remembering that it was not the rulers themselves who physically built their great works. Said drafted Egyptian peasants, mostly against their will, to work on the Suez Canal, along with captured slaves from the Sudan. The Suez Canal Company raised no objections, despite the fact that both Britain and France had officially outlawed slavery in their territories. At its peak, there were around 30,000 coerced or enslaved workers on the project. This was a recipe for discontent, and there were a number of small strikes and work revolts that halted construction several times. Maybe it was finally the modern state, combined with the modern commercial organization of a corporation, that finally overcame the logistical barriers to building a canal along the route of the modern Suez Canal. The canal was completed in 1869, but it did not prove to be the source of stability Egypt's leaders thought it might be. Further efforts at modernization were financed in part by the sale of cotton to Europe. After 1860, a cotton famine swept Europe when the U.S. cotton market was cut off during the Civil War. Egyptian cotton strove to fill the gap, and prices spiked. However, this situation could not last, and realistically, Egypt could never compete with the United States. After the Civil War, the prices receded. However, many individuals, including the government, had taken out vast sums of money in debt to finance further cotton expansion. This forced Said Pasha's successor, Ismaili Pasha, to sell his shares of the company in 1875 to the British. By that time, the British government had actually taken over the finances of Egypt, as Ismaili had borrowed much of his money from British bankers. A revolt, which was caused by the dissatisfaction of army officers, upset with British control over the Egyptian economy, forced Ismaili into exile in 1879. The British military bombarded Alexandria and occupied Egypt until 1922. The Suez Canal became a symbol of imperial control over the people of Egypt. Even after the British withdrew in 1922, the Suez Canal Company maintained control over the canal. In 1956, a new leader of Egypt, Gamal Nasser, who was intensely nationalistic and had abolished the monarchy in his path to power, was seeking funding for another major infrastructure project, which he hoped might raise the fortunes of Egypt. And he looked to the Suez Canal to get funding for this project. Nasser took over the Suez Canal via nationalization, in effect fulfilling the goal of the first rulers of an independent Egypt. Though Britain and France, with the aid of Israel, attempted to forcibly take back control of the canal, international pressure forced them to withdraw. The Suez Crisis of 1956 is normally viewed through the lens of the Cold War and the end of British colonial hegemony. While Nasser's forces were pummeled, Nasser nonetheless rallied international opinion to his side, and the British and the French withdrew. Perhaps 1956 ought not to be viewed as a Western defeat, but perhaps also as an Egyptian victory. The story of a nation taking back its destiny, or perhaps the triumph of international will to defeat aggression of a larger nation against a smaller nation. The story of the Suez Canal forces students of history to consider the power of agency. The traditional narrative ignores the decision-making of Egypt's leaders. What is often implied to be a poor decision should instead be seen as a strategic move by leaders to strengthen their nation. The story of the canal also serves as a reminder that an inability to accomplish a specific task, such as the inability to build the Suez Canal at an earlier date, should not be automatically viewed as an inability to recognize its value. These individual actions should be analyzed within their own context. And finally, when examining the history of imperialism, it's always important to remember to look at imperial actions through the eyes of the nations being controlled or coerced, for it might tell a completely different story and help enrich our understanding of history. I want to thank you for joining me on this bite of history. I hope you've learned something, but I hope you also walk away with a few questions. This is Mr. Little, and I'll see you next time.